Welcome to Althing Considered, a conversation on life and faith in heathenry, Ásatrú, and Norse paganism from the Troth, education and service for inclusive heathenry.
That's right. What are you waiting for? It was so nice. I had to play it almost twice. Welcome, everybody, to Althing Considered, the weekly talk show from the Troth, where we talk about life in Ásatrú, heathenry, and Norse paganism. I am here, Ben Kowalski-Grayek, the communications director for the Troth. I'm here, as usual, with the CEO and president, Lauren Crow. Hi, Lauren Crow. And
sorry, I please forgive me. I have an ear infection, so I'm 80% here, but I'm here. So
there's a pun in there. I know it. And tonight's guest would know it if there was a pun in here. This is welcome back to the show, Dr. Ben Wagoner, the Berserker academic, who we are so happy to have here tonight because he knows quite a bit about the runes. So we are hoping to tap into his expertise. This evening,
don't forget
about runes past and present.
Don't forget Troth Elder.
Oh, and Troth Elder.
Troth Elder, Shope of the Troth, which is our esteemed wordsmith of the Troth, as well as my favorite kindred brother. So.
Well, and may I say I'm glad to be here because it's a much welcome distraction from having to sit down and grade exam papers. It's that time of year for us, and grades are due on Tuesday, and by the time that's over with, I will definitely be in the mood for drinking several horns of mead and slaughtering people with a battle axe. I won't actually do it, but it will be a definite temptation.
Well, speaking of opportunities to
yes, Lauren, news and updates.
Yeah, so I'm going to be one of the guests of honor at Harmony in the Hollow Pagan and Pride in Russellville, Arkansas, coming up Memorial Day weekend. So you want to come out. So Harmony in the Hollow is an interesting thing. It's kicking off, first of all, Queer Pride season in Arkansas, but also it is uniquely both a gay pride event and a pagan pride event, kind of a gay pagan pride event. It's awesome. There's going to be a parade walk with costume contest classes, as well as vendors. I'm going to be there with a selection of Troth books, so you'll want to check that out. Also live music by my good friend S.J. Tucker, Ginger Doss, Linda Millard, Krista Chapman Green, Lou Guru, and the Earthbone Band. So come out. All weekend, starts Friday, going to be over on Monday. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to have two classes. The first one is going to be on chord magic and chords and knows about folk magic. The second one is going to be on inclusive runes. So come check that out. We're going to have a great time.
And meanwhile, in Minnesota, I'll be watching professional wrestling on Cinco de Mayo in a brewery as it was intended to be viewed. So that's what we'll be up to.
And then also, don't forget, if you're new to Heathenry and want to check out a cool supportive group, we have a Heathen Essentials study chat that meets on the first and third Saturdays. So that's going to be tomorrow if you're watching live at noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern time zones. But you definitely want to check that out. It's a great supportive environment if you're new to Heathenry and want to learn. In fact, Crystal is one of our facilitators right here in the audience. But yeah, we definitely want you to come check it out. It's a wonderful supportive environment to ask questions about Heathenry. If you're working through our free Heathen Essentials class, which is open to anyone, you don't have to be a member. It's also a great study group to kind of keep you accountable for that.
It's such an amazing service that Crystal does for people. So
It is.
if you guys do want to help, do need help with that course, or just want to talk, Crystal's going to be there. And with that, I suppose we are going to get into our main topic for tonight, which is going to be the runes.
The runes.
The
runes. The runes are
the
on
runes.
fire. We don't need no water. Well, never mind.
Yeah. And before we get into that, you guys might not think an alphabet would have so much dark history along with it, but we're about to show you a little bit later on in the month, because this entire month is going to be about runes. But there's some dark stuff in the history of runes and the history of their use and the history of let's say their misuse and appropriation. So I want to just slap a content warning on here, because we could get into some dark stuff. So do be prepared. I know it's an alphabet, right? How bad could it be? It can be, and you can find out how bad. So two of you.
Really, yeah. And also just a fair warning on that as well, that unfortunately, like most of the things, they're considered Germanic or Norse culture. It does get used by bad people. So just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to turn this over to you guys because you're the experts here. I'm the guy who read probably one book on the runes, and I think it was Pollington's book, and I'm like, okay, I'm good with this. But you guys have read and done a lot more, so I wanted to tap you guys about. So, what are the runes for those who aren't those who might not know?
All right. Can I go back to the very, very, very beginning?
Yeah.
Maybe even before this slide comes in.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, if you go back to the very, 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 very beginning, it starts when some Bronze Age copper miners in the Sinai Peninsula who spoke a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic, got the bright idea to borrow Egyptian hieroglyphics, give them different sound values, and use them to start representing sounds in their own language. And it spread from there. It got picked up by the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians passed it all over the Mediterranean because they had lots of ships and sailed everywhere. And they passed it on to the Greeks. I should be clear, I'm referring to the alphabet.
Yeah, just the concept.
There were actually there were multiple versions of the Greek alphabet. The one that everybody learns today, if you're a physicist or a frat boy, is the one that got used for writing the dialect of Athens, which became classical Greek, the prestige dialect. But there were lots of variations on that alphabet. Some with different letters that a Greek never used, that got spread all over the place. And one of them got picked up by some people in northern Italy called the Etruscans. And the Etruscans passed it to the Romans, and that's the ancestor of the alphabet that's used for most European languages, the so-called Latin alphabet. But the Etruscans also passed it to various peoples of what's now northern Italy and bits of surrounding countries who used it to write languages that we don't know an awful lot about. One of them called, and again, nobody knows very much about Communic, but we can read it because it used a variety of the Etruscan alphabet. And in roughly the year 50 before Common Era, or before Christ, if you apply it that way, somebody used an alphabet similar to the Communic to write a couple of words in an early Germanic language on an ancient helmet that had been made about 200 years before, and that was offered as an offering, a sacrifice, called Neg in, I believe, Slovenia. And it says Harigasti Tewa, and Harigasti is interpretable as army guest, and Tewa is Tewas, that's very early form of the name of the god Tyr. And that seems to be the first time that a version of this alphabet was used to write sentences in Germanic. Now, the helmet itself dates to about 250 before Common Era, or before Christ, if you like. And in the more folkish-ish areas of early Ásatrú in America, there were a number of groups that started using the runic era instead of the common Western calendar to date things. And that's basically the current year plus 250, because 250 before Common Era was the year in which Odin gave the runes to man. So right now it's 2024. So this would be what, 2274 in the runic era. But I haven't seen a lot of people trying to do that recently. That seems to be a fashion that's kind of come and gone.
Yeah, it was really a thing.
And anyway, the inscription is thought to be younger than the helmet.
Yeah, it was a thing in the 90s and 80s to like romantify. That's how we ended up with positions like steer and all those weird position names in the trope that we eliminated last year, because there was definitely this move to romantic languageify everything.
And was that around the era when people started getting like Norse names?
Right. That's been around way before that.
Oh.
Like pagan names, that comes from pagan names and Wiccan craft names.
And I just missed that. Right. Like by a year, I think I just missed that.
I never had one, and I was around.
But in early issues of the Troths Journal, Iduna, the publisher, used to Thorfinn Einarsson, as he went by at the time, used to use German black letters instead of italics, because we don't want italics because that's from Italy and that's Roman, and the only thing the only thing Rome is good for is for burning, sacking, and pillaging,
and pasta,
which actually makes them a little hard to read if you go back. But that's a long time ago. That's about 1990 we're doing that. Okay, so anyway, so there's variants of this Etruscan alphabet that get passed around, and on the Negau helmet, one of them is first used to write. It's not exactly the same as the runes as we come to know them, but it's used to write a couple of words in a Germanic language. And then if we fast forward a bit to about the year 400, when you start seeing more and more artifacts that have rune inscriptions. Some of the oldest are from a place called Vimos in Denmark, and most of them are pretty short. So if you want to look at this slide, there's a mysterious inscription
yes,
found on the 1,200-year artifact from the time of the Vikings. Archaeologists have finally deciphered what these mystic letters say, and they say comb.
Oh.
Ooh. Comb. Kambar. This is a comb.
It's how, you know what? Sometimes maybe on the other side it was written like whose comb it was. Maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
Bjorn's comb. Don't touch.
Here's the thing. Anyone besides me like have sticky notes all over things when you were trying to learn language in high school? Like in the mirror, bed, like you're trying to learn different words. Maybe that's what this guy was doing. He was trying to learn the word for comb, so he wrote it down.
On a comb.
It's possible it belonged to an ancient Viking whose name was Thorstein, not the nuclear physicist.
Thorstein,
because he needed to have names on everything to remind him what they were.
But yes, comb. Yes. So mysterious.
Thorstein, non-rocket scientist. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. This slide is where you burst people's bubble, Ben. So
yeah, you find the vast majority of rune inscriptions that we find seem to be perfectly mundane. There are people's names on their gear. There's a site called Illerup Audal, where it looks like the winning side in a battle basically sacrificed the entire losing army in a bog. And because they used to do that back then. And a number of rune inscriptions have been preserved, but they all seem to be personal names on, somebody's gear. They're just name tags. This sword belongs to Vagnio, for example. That was one guy. Jumping forward quite a bit in time to roughly the year 1300 in Norway, there was an excavation in the 1950s after the wharf district of the city of Bergen burned. And as they were rebuilding it, they happened to do some archaeology, and they found a whole bunch of rune inscriptions dating to about the year 1300. This is after the Viking Age. Runes are still in use, and they do include some magical charms and love charms and filthy graffiti and a business letter and one stick that says, Gifa says you have to come home, which seems to have been written by somebody's wife and brought to that guy. And we think he might have been drinking in the tavern, because the rest of the inscription is a bunch of marks that don't fit. Gifa says I gotta go home. Well, let me tell you what I think of Gifa. Yeah, right there. So, runes could be used for absolutely anything. Oh, there's a whole bunch of produce. If you were selling your wool in the market, you might have your name carved on a little wooden tag and things like that. They could be used for very mundane things, and probably most often were. You'll notice that the date of the Bergen inscriptions is about 1300. That's about 300 years after the adoption of Christianity. And there are rune inscriptions in pagan contexts, but there are rune inscriptions that would have been made by sincere Christians. And the Christian church itself never particularly objected to the use of runes.
Runes were used as a script up until I believe the very earliest 20th century in some rural parts of Sweden, if I'm correct.
I believe so. They were.
Yeah, the Delicarian runes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I mean, it's been an active alphabet.
Mm-hmm. And the rune poems that we have, they were written down in medieval parchments, and they would have been written down probably by monks or priests. Monks at the time having, not an awful lot of, exciting things going on in their lives. Some of them got really into writing down, runes and secret alphabets and things like that. There was a German priest and missionary named Rabanus Maurus who wrote a little manuscript explaining the runes. And, he was Christian. There are Old English rune inscriptions in a Christian context. Do we have one in this slideshow? I made the slides a long time ago, and I can't remember everything that's there. Oh, yeah.
There's one right here.
Yeah, that's an Old English gravestone with an omega on it and a big cross, and then the runes spell out the name of the lady that's buried there, Hildefrith. So, clear evidence that the church at the time didn't see runes as intrinsically pagan.
I don't know if it's later in the presentation, but when did the runes when did people start thinking of pagan runes? Runes are pagan. When did that association start? Was it in the Middle Ages when it started, like late Middle Ages or Romantic era? Like when was it? Because there's clearly an association now.
Well, hang on just a minute. We'll get there.
Pagan, right?
So just a second. So there's an example of the tags that Ben was talking about with like merchandise tags, where Thorlock owns me, love charms, or maybe just wishful thinking.
Ostmin Kisvik.
That one. We're just gonna go past that one. To business letters. People were sending actual, letters. I didn't get the beer nor the fish. That sounds very depressing.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see what we've got in here. Yeah, okay. Now, what they are here, obviously, are a system of letters from the Etruscan or Roman alphabet. They're a variant probably of the Greek alphabet. They have vertical and diagonal strokes, but rarely horizontal ones, probably because they were carved on sticks. And so it would be really hard to make that horizontal cut. It would split the wood. And then, of course, we have inscriptions that date back to 160 CE. This is the oldest inscription that we have. It's a guy's name, we think.
Yeah, Harja.
Harja.
It would have been related to words like Ein Herjar, meaning warrior or raider, related to our modern English word to harry.
Mm-hmm.
To harry in the sense of to fight or to pursue. So Harja probably means warrior, and it's on a comb. So he was evidently known as Harja, not scientist, to his people.
Right. So, the alphabet, which we call the Futhark after the first 6 letters, and, like the influence of the coverstone, people used to carve the entire thing in because graffiti is timeless.
Or is it that, is this like, I wonder sometimes if someone carves the whole thing, like they're practicing the runes. Like sometimes you'll see that, and then you'll see someone saying, I carved the runes, or, Bjorn learned the runes.
Graffiti is still timeless.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, if memory serves, that Futhark was not visible on the original stone because the stone was covering a grave. You could speculate. You have to do there's a lot of speculation about the runes. You almost can't avoid it. Is that believe that each rune has some sort of individual power to it, then carving the whole thing is a way of summoning up all of the totality of this power and putting it to work to guarding the dead person, maybe, or possibly not. Hard to say.
We're practiced.
But you do get some other artifacts like bracteates that also have just the entire Futhark written. What's in the next slide? I think there's one of them.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. A bracteate is a coin-like object that's made out of sheet metal, in this case gold, that's been hammered over some sort of mold. So you can make many copies by carving a mold and then hammering sheet gold over it. You can make lots of these bracteates with the same design. And the earliest bracteates are made in direct imitation of late Roman coins. But the designs get more and more, not always more complex, but more and more distinctive and less like ever had in mind as you go forward in time a bit. And they start showing up, they start showing rune inscriptions. And the Vadstena bracteate has a complete futhark plus the words Luatua. If you figure out what Luatua is, feel free to tell me. Sorry, my son is in the next room, and I said Luatua, and he said, "Shh, don't say it. You'll summon them."
Sorry. So this is actually the oldest.
If anybody just got invaded by demonic possession, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So this is actually the oldest of the Futhark, the Elder Futhark. Now, something that a lot of people are mistaken about is the Elder Futhark was never actually used to write or speak Old Norse. Like, they're not contemporaries. This would have been used to speak write Proto-Germanic, Proto-Norse. Proto.
Probably not the very oldest stages of, well, actually, it might have been, because there's a couple of rune letters that made their way into the Gothic alphabet. So it would have been a late stage of Proto-Germanic. Most of them would be, as far as I think, the language basically predates the split between North Germanic and West Germanic, which is the split between Scandinavian languages and, English, German, Dutch, Frisian. But yeah, this predates the origin of Old Norse. This predates the Northern Germanic branch. And the names, by the way, we don't know what the names of the Elder runes were. Nobody ever wrote that part down. What we have is some later references to later versions of the Futhark. In what you're looking at here is the first printing of the Old English rune poem. And you can see it goes down to, F-U-Th-O-R-C, and then that's a G down there. And then next to it, you have the verses of this Old English rune poem. And work out what their names of the letters were in Old English. And you can also work out what the names of the rune letters were in Old Norse. And you can try to work backwards from those to come up with a plausible form of what the words for these letters would have been in Proto-Germanic. And that's where we get Fehu, Uruz, Thurisaj, Ansuj, Raitho, Kenaj, and so on. But we don't actually know if that's what the earliest carvers would have called them.
Oh, wow. Okay. That is an interesting fact that I think needs to. So wait, we don't actually know that these were the names of the runes. These were approximated or just made up.
Yeah. They're reconstructed.
Well, we know that in Old English they would have been called Feo, Ur, Thorn, Os, Rav, Cain. We know in Old Norse they would have been called Fe, Ur, Thurs, Aus, Wraith, Kaun. I think I've got that right. I'm doing this from memory.
And somebody walked that back
Take
to
forms like
Proto-Germanic?
that and try to come up with what
Yeah.
the progenitor of both of them would have been. And it's
Wow.
probably reasonably close. It's, they probably, if you could go back in time to, the Roman frontier in the year 100, you probably could have made yourself sort of understood, maybe. But we don't actually know. That's a linguistic reconstruction. It's not, we don't know what the actual name really was. That's just our best guess from the evidence that we've got.
And it's the
Hey, that's why my
reconstructions,
chants are
however,
working.
our reconstructions are at this point 500 years old, because they were done in, I believe, the 16th or 17th century, when those linguistic at least for the runes from the Elder Futhark, I believe, started around the 16th or 17th century when they started trying to reconstruct some of this.
Yeah, I think the first that anybody takes seriously would have actually been people like the Grimms, which is more 19th century. So I don't
Fair.
think they're that far back. Although I should mention what you're
Now that
looking
they
at in the
started
slide right there.
trying,
Yeah. Well, what you're looking at in this slide is a printing of the Old English rune poem, and I want to say that dates to about 1700. When this was printed. And unfortunately, a fire in Robert Cotton's manuscript collection destroyed the original script. This print of it is the only copy that we have. We can't go back and look at the original manuscript, unfortunately. But yeah, about the 16 and 1700s is when you get people like Humphrey Wanley in England, and Ole Worm in Denmark, and oh God, what's his name? That very eccentric cleric in Sweden whose name has just flown right out of my head.
I know who you're talking about. My brain is not.
Yeah, when they start collating and publish inscriptions and trying to interpret them in various ways. Yeah, that's about when scholarly attention starts focusing on the runes.
So I think that that's a very, and of course, then, like all languages and alphabets, it evolved, right? Because even like the English alphabet we're using now is not the English alphabet that was used 500 years ago. So then we move into the Scandinavian Futhark, and this is what Viking era Norse would have actually used, would have been this alphabet.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you'll notice that a bunch of sounds are missing. So a lot of these letters had to do double duty. So if the O sound would have been written using ur, the U letter. And we see the P sound would have been written with the B rune. And the G sound would have been written with the K rune, and so on. So this, which can make these a little bit tricky to read, because many of these rune letters would have more than one possible phonetic meaning.
And Ben, you said that the use of these runes persisted into medieval Christianity, into the Christian period as well, in the Middle Ages. Was there any indication that anyone tried to ban the use of the runes, like don't write stuff in runes anymore, or was it just accepted that some people write in runes?
Not that I've ever heard. There's there's a lot of famous Scandinavian rune stones, that have carvings of various sorts, some of them very artistic and some of them a little less so, and various rune inscriptions on them. Oftentimes they're memorials for the dead, which probably doubled as property markers. Thor, raised this monument in memory of Thorvald, his father, who died horribly slaughtered in distant Serkland. Oh, by the way, this is his land. It belongs to his family. And if you're not part of the family, bugger off. A lot of the memorials are land claims or documentation of the chain of ownership of a family's land. And some of them have crosses on them. There's at least one that I think is I can't remember where it is, but it's the oldest depiction in Scandinavian art of the Magi, the three wise men going to see the infant Jesus. And there are several late ones that mention, what an awesome Christian such so-and-so had been. And as far as I've ever been able to find, there's no sense that any of these are doing anything pagan-y, that there's anything pagan about the runes. It's just what people used at the time to raise memorial stones like this.
Based on the research that I have found, one of the biggest detriments to the runic alphabet being used widespread was the printing press. Is that there was an encouragement to move to Latin alphabets because then you weren't having to make customized runic printing blocks. So one theory that I have read, and it makes sense to me, was that the printing press moved most of Europe to a Latin alphabet, hence why you saw that steep decline in the use of runes as a writing system.
Right. This memorial stone is, just says Klepir and Asa raised the stone in memory of Ulf. This may come from pagan times. It's suggested that the beast on there is Fenrir. It sort of looks like a very stylized wolf, and maybe the ship underneath might be Naglfari, the ship of the dead.
Oh, and is there a snake eating its own tail?
I mean, these things aren't labeled, but we do have some runestones. We've got one that's got this wonderful depiction of a giantess riding on a wolf and using snakes for reins. She's holding up one snake, evidently as a whip, and there's another one that she's holding that's in the mouth, riding on the wolf's back. And I can't remember exactly where, but that's one of the things that female Jotuns are deliberately said to do. Ride on wolves with snakes for reins. It's been suggested she might be Hirokin, the giantess the Jotunja who was the one who pushed out Baldur's funeral ship, if you remember that story. So some of these have pagan imagery on them. There's some that have Thor's hammers. There's some that have, possible mythic scenes. But after the coming of Christianity, the scenes change, but the runes don't. You go from giantesses riding on wolves to the three wise men coming to see the baby Jesus, but they're still written in, the same rune alphabet.
Right. So they used them for memorials. They used them to label stuff. One common practice that people do today is runic divination. What evidence, if any, is there for runic divination in the pagan era?
All right. An awful lot of it comes out of this one passage in Tacitus's Germania. Now, Tacitus was a Roman political wonk. He went through various offices in the Roman government and ended up as governor of Asia. As far as anybody can now tell, he never visited Germany at all, but he did know people who had gone, and wrote this book describing the Germans called Germania. It's not based on firsthand eyewitness evidence. Some of what it says we can confirm through archaeology. Some of it you have to be a little more careful about. And one thing is that Germans are crazy about divination, and they'll cut a branch off a fruit-bearing tree, cut that into pieces, and put marks. The words he uses is notai, which just means some kind of mark or sign or symbol. And then you scatter them over a white cloth, pick up 3 at random, and interpret the meaning of the answer to the question that you've just asked.
So this is where we get the practice today, yes, of carving these or carving or burning these symbols into little wooden pieces, right? From this passage, I presume.
Yeah. Basically, all of modern rune divination has come pretty much out of Tacitus's one passage. And yes, as Renata points out, the Germanic frontier was incredibly wide. I mean, it went from the North Sea down the Rhine, cutting across to the Danube, and all the way to the east. And again, with Tacitus, he never went anywhere in Germania. Some of his friends did, but we don't really know who they were talking to. I mean, for that matter, in Tacitus's time, there were some Germans who'd been living in Rome. So maybe Tacitus got his information from there. But, again, this is a very small nation, and it is, imprecise. There is a lot we really don't know. We don't absolutely know that those symbols that Tacitus mentions were even runes. They could have been anything. All he says is that they're symbols. They're notai.
So, Ben, you asked the question.
And we don't know how widespread it was.
Yeah. So, Ben, you asked the question specifically, when did we start looking at runes as magic?
Yes.
So,
when was that transition from, okay, it's a writing system to pagan magic?
Okay.
So we got, I was going to answer.
Go ahead.
So you've got.
There are pagan.
I think there's the delay. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah.
So while I would say that the first person that really kind of brought that into consciousness is our favorite Swede, Johannes Burris, who basically, based on a vision, used a combination of Kabbalah and like Western esoteric and blah, 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 to develop the first system called Altaruna back in the 17th century. I believe I'm right. And that was kind of the first kind of, I guess you could call it a organized runic system of magic. And that, but once again, within these systems, I think the thing that you have to understand, even with things like Aldaruna, and a lot of what you would consider the esoteric practices of that time, because you're also looking, this is also around the same time as a lot of, Blavatsky and a lot of other, esoteric leaders. A lot of that wasn't necessary. They didn't necessarily see themselves as pagan, right? They were spiritualists. They were esoteric. They were, Western occultism, but pagan would not be a word they would describe themselves as. And I don't, as far as I know, Burris didn't consider himself pagan. He was a magician.
But working in a Christian context.
Yeah.
I don't know that much about Boreas's system. I think a lot of it has never been properly published. But yeah, he could not have been an open pagan in this time, even if he particularly wanted to be. I mean, he was pretty high up in the around the Swedish, royalty. He had a very esoteric interpretation of these runes. And his work, if memory serves, does recognize, the names and some of the powers of the old gods. But fundamentally, he's in a mystical Christian context.
Yeah, he was
Now, if you go back before that, there are rune inscriptions that probably did have a magical or esoteric meaning. I mean, there's a lot of words that show up on the old bracteates, like and luatua and salu salu, which may have had some sort of magical function, although you have to be really careful because there's an old joke among archaeologists that if you can't understand what something is, it must have been religious.
Or it could just been someone screwing up and just going,
here's this thing.
I misspelled this word. Just throw it out and start again. No one's going to find this anyway, right? Like,
yeah, something like that. Yeah, or there's that. There is that mention in Sigdrifumal, where the Valkyrie Sigdrifa tells Sigurd, learn victory runes if you want victory. Carve them on your sword's hilt, carve them on your sword's guard, and call on Tyr.
Yeah.
So that would have been written a little bit after Christianity, but it's possible it preserves a bit of an older tradition where you carve runes on your sword because you want, the gods to grant you victory.
Okay, so this is something that I wanted to get into you guys with you guys. There's a lot of reference with runic practitioners to the Sigdrifamal, but also to the Havamal, where it's talking about how Odin hung upside down 9 days, and he got the runes. He learned the runes. And then he talks about, this one I know, this one I know, this one I know. That later portion of the Havamal. And I've heard that is interpreted as Odin learning the runic alphabet specifically. I've also heard it interpreted as synecdoche, so it's using the word rune as like we'd say I saw letters when we mean I saw words spelled in letters. He's saying I saw spells written in runes, and I learned them. So he's using the word runes as synecdoche, so that's the small part referring to the whole of I saw letters, the letters made up spells, and the listener would know, oh, he's talking about magic spells. Like that's the true interpretation. So it's like he's either learning the alphabet or he's learning magic spells that are being spelled in the alphabet.
I personally,
Lauren, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I personally think for a non-literate society, words are magic. Being able to preserve down an exact recipe to make a healing balm for some illness, being able to write down an exact story and preserve it forever. I mean, I think it could be either. To me, though, I have always taken it as the actual letters, because to go from an oral society to a written society is magic. Whether, there's a magic to that you can't deny, being able to adopt the written word, just that itself.
And Dr. Wagner?
There's also the fact that the word rune, it can refer to the letters. It's also sometimes used to mean secret, and it's also sometimes used to mean counsel, advice. There's one of the Old English poems, wise men are sitan at runa. Literally, they're sitting at runes, but what it means is they're sitting apart and, taking counsel, taking each other's advice and discussing and, debating what to do. So when it talks about Odin learning the runes, does it mean the letters? Does it mean secrets? Does it mean he's gaining advice? Does it mean all three at the same time? Ooh. You also have the fact that the word rune got borrowed into Finnish, and one of its meanings is a song. the Finnish epic poem assembled by a guy named Lönnrot, the Kalevala, is divided into runos. I don't know what the plural is, but each canto, I suppose, would be the English of it, is a runo. So is it something you can sing? Is it a secret that you have? Is it advice? Is it a letter? It's not always clear exactly what is being talked about. And that is again one of the imprecise things that we sometimes just have to kind of fumble our way through.
Yeah, and it sort of also goes back to the Sigdrifamal as well, like carve runes into your weapon.
Right.
Do you mean carve a magic word? Like, is there a word that you want me to carve in there with the runes? Or are you just saying, yeah, put some letters on there?
Or am I supposed to carve the word victory? Is that what victory rune actually means?
On my sword? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's and you know, that kind of is a nice poetic image. You know, carve victory into your sword. Oh wow, okay, cool, right? Like that sounds badass. So this idea of the runes being used for magic is reflected in certain interpretations of the poetry as well, the pre-Christian or immediately post-Christian poems.
But if you look at historic,
you do get in the Havamal, there's that one verse that does link runes with religious practice, and I'm doing this completely from memory. But it's where Odin starts asking, what, Vestu verista skal?
Yes.
Do you know how you must carve them? Do you know how you must them? Do you know how you must Vestu fe fresta skal, Vestu fe fal skal? Do you know how to test them? Do you know how to color them? Do you know how to ask? Do you know how to sacrifice? You know, he asks a series of 8 questions that are 4 of them are basically, do you know how to use runes? And the other 4 are, do you know how to worship?
Is the color part, I hate to bring this up, but so some people have a practice of blooding their runes. I'm not going to recommend the particular practice. I don't know. But some people have used that verse of color them to mean that color them with like your blood, color them. That's the interpretation that's used to say, yes, you know, he means blood them, to activate them.
So we showed a picture earlier, and I've shed it since then. But essentially, rune stones used to be painted. Like when you constructed a rune stone, it was like we see it with devoid of color now, because time, kind of like, you know, ancient Greek and Roman statues were full of color, but we see them as plain marble because time.
Yeah.
It's the same thing though with runes. Rune stones were painted. They were bright and vibrant and beautiful things. So do you know how to color them can simply be, do you know how to paint this runic inscription you've made, this rune stone you've erected?
Yeah. The bit with blood probably comes out of an episode in Egil's saga, where Egil has gotten seriously crosswise with King Eric Bloodaxe and his Queen Heinous Bitch, and they're trying to kill him. He should put a feast, and he's been drinking. He's been trying to drink the feast dry. Basically, he's been drinking this ridiculous amount of ale, and the queen gets the idea to poison him. So she sends the host of the feast, a guy named Barv, gives him a horn of poisoned ale and tells him to go give Egil. And Egil is not so drunk that he doesn't know what's going on. So he carves runes in the horn, stabs himself in the palm, smears the runes with blood, and speaks a verse, and the horn burst. And shortly thereafter, the guy who brought him the horn of poisoned ale gets killed, and it's on. And yeah, Egil makes some permanent enemies out of Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild the Heinous Bitch. That's not really her name.
No,
It should be.
I was like, that's a weird Scandinavian
Right.
name. Never heard it that way before. But the thing that
That's the that comes to mind when I think of blooding. There is an instance in the sagas where somebody did that. You always have to bear in mind that the sagas were written a couple of hundred years after the fact. I tend to think of the sagas as being analogous to westerns
like spaghetti westerns or pulp novels.
made 100 years after the Wild West closed, and they do have real people, General Custer and Sitting Bull and the 7th Cavalry and the Lakota, were real people. Some of them are scrupulously historically accurate. Many of them kind of sweep over, some of the things that really did go on in Wild West towns, like, prostitution and drug use. Some of them are like Wild Wild West is just total fantasy with cowboy hats. And the sagas are kind of like that, ranging from probably very good history to fantasy, using all those images from the past to comment on the present day. So that's the way I tend to think of sagas. And that means you have to be careful when taking them for historical evidence of what people actually did. There's other marks about that.
I wanted to quick transition because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about modern rune systems as well. So I'm going to kind of pull it from history into modern rune systems. So I was asking just before the show, there's a lot of different people who teach the runes today, right? Who teach different runic systems. And I can't possibly ask everybody to name every single person who has a book somewhere published by Llewellyn about how to use runes for magic. But if you guys could go through, like, of the runic systems, if you could tell people like what runic systems you've heard of, where you think they came from, and how they developed.
So our men in runes, we're not going to talk about tonight because we're going to do a whole show on that.
Yep,
so
that's
just letting you guys know. So Ben, let's start with Ralph Bloom, our favorite.
Woohoo!
First of all, that's sarcasm, by the way. A lot of his stuff was heavily pulled from I Ching, UFO lore, and his posterior.
Very 70s. The Futhark Order is one of those things served from the oldest Futhark inscriptions all the way, into, post-medieval times in Scandinavia. The order is still Futhark. Bloom's book, he somewhere got a set of little rune tiles and based into them, what order do you wish to be read in? And then started drawing them at random. So his book, or at least the oldest editions of his book, put the runes in a completely different order. They're in the order that he happened to pull them out of the bag the night that he wrote the book.
I did learn something very important.
A lot of the big thing that he is notorious for.
The blank rune. Yeah, I learned something very important from him.
What's that?
5x5 injection molding is cheaper than 6x4.
Okay, explain that. So I hear about this Bloom system, and people talk about they say, "Oh yeah, Bloom, the blank rune." So what did Bloom say the blank rune was, and what was the blank rune actually? Because I've heard that these are two completely different things.
Okay, well, the original Futharks don't have a blank. There's a space between words that needs to be marked. It's usually marked by a dot or a few dots, or sometimes a little X or a little cross. But yeah, they didn't use the space as a character, not the way we use spaces today. memory serves, Bloom put the blank rune in because if you draw the blank rune, it means that whatever you're asking about is undetermined, it is unfixed, it is this is the rune of weird.
It's Odin's rune. It's Odin's rune.
Okay.
It's I recently read this for something I'm working on. So it's the Odin's rune. It's the basically what would be like the beginning, the end, the divineness of all man. It's very white people Buddhist. That's the best way I can describe it.
I had to pull back because you're blowing my mind too much.
White man Buddhist, yeah, right there.
No, just you talk about the blank rune, all the stuff that it means. So what actually happened?
Well, it's cheaper to do 5x5 injection molding patterns than it is 6x4, and you have 24 runes. I'll let you guys do the math.
So, okay, so just
for
people who don't understand manufacturing,
plastic rune tiles.
Yeah. So for people who don't understand manufacturing or mass manufacturing, what Lauren's talking about is that the runes are printed on a 5x5 grid.
Well, it's basically it was basically, they were little, almost like little Scrabble tiles.
Yeah, Scrabble tiles.
Plastic. Yeah. And they were screen printed on the original sets. And to basically print out 25 of them was cheaper than making 24 of them in a set. So the blank rune is a blank. Now, a lot of other people produced it with a blank rune, and they would explicitly say, "We have there's a blank in here in case you lose one." Blah blah blah. But Ralph Bloom decided to make his all fancy, and his stuff, like I said, it was very heavily. Yeah, it's very it's almost nothing. Like he even wrote like a 12-step program with the runes, which makes no sense. It's nothing in Ralph Bloom's rune reading has any, other than some god names and rune names, has anything to do with Germanic mythology, like anything. It is completely his own creation.
And so Ralph Bloom is I think he's pretty well ridiculed today. I actually don't know that many people who follow Ralph Bloom's system. Maybe there are still a few out there.
There are a lot of non-heathen pagans who do. I've run into a lot of Wiccans, a lot of non-heathen pagans who love Ralph Bloom.
Love it. Okay, right. So you'll find Ralph Bloom's. You might still see Ralph Bloom's system in practice, especially if someone draws a blank rune and says, "Oh, look at this." Maybe you might be talking to someone who read them some Ralph Bloom. So if Ralph Bloom's fairly well ridiculed in the community, are there other rune systems out there that we see frequently? Like who else made a rune system?
I've seen, I can't remember her name, but there's a system of witches runes that circulates that don't have anything to do with the Germanic runes at all. They're basically little pictograms for man, woman, person, camera, TV. That's not it. But yeah, that has no connection with the Germanic runes. I mean, I don't really care if people use them or not. System that has to be judged, completely on its own merits. You'll see the word rune sometimes used for other alphabets that have a similar angular shape, probably because they were meant to be carved instead of written with a pen. So, for example, the Orkhon runes, as far as I know, they're not historically related to the Germanic runes. They would have been used to write early Turkic languages in North Asia. I think they're related to a system of letters that was used to write early Hungarian, if memory serves. Hey, Lauren, you remember the Armenian runes?
Oh, no.
Wait, what?
So we had a guy come.
Maybe we don't need to tell that story.
I will tell the very brief version that one of the very first pagan prides Ben and I went to, a guy got up and did an hour-long presentation on the Armenian runes. And we think he meant Armenian runes, but we're still not sure. And it was 20 years ago.
Paganism, everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'll see letters that look like Germanic runes but aren't sometimes referenced. And then, of course, Tolkien came up with the runic alphabet because Tolkien was a professor of, Old Norse English and used to recite Beowulf in class. And so the Kirth system that's used in Lord of the Rings is, I don't know that anybody's ever tried to use that in, pagan ritual, but it is something you'll see that's out there.
So,
And
go ahead.
then we've got a fellow by the name of Stephen Flowers.
So I was about to get to is my quick and dirty.
who
Why
You guys are
Yeah.
completely on the same page. Look at you guys.
I was about to get to my quick and dirty why Stephen Flowers' stuff is not good, but go ahead.
Right. Who's a grad student in University of Texas in the Germanics program, and he comes across a now I can't remember if it was a book by Gorsleben or somebody else, but he comes across a German book on rune magic and immediately falls in love with it and is driven everything can. And most of his sources are German occultists working before World War II and working with the system that was being developed by, well, Guido von List is the obvious name, but there were people like Siegfried Kummer, Friedrich Malby, that were also doing very occultic runic things, and we'll talk about those later. Under the name Edred Thorson, he ends up publishing a book called Futhark, which presents a system of runic practice. Since he's a grad student at the time in Germanic, early Germanic language and literature, he does know his stuff a hell of a lot more than Ralph Bloom ever did. And he's able to, draw on the oldest rune poems that we have and the oldest rune inscriptions and that. But he's also heavily influenced by this pre-war German romantic occultism. So, for example, in his book Rune Lore, you get the concept of runes as being these sort of energy fields. A rune is an energy field that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. There we go. In the wise words of a third well-known Ben.
Famous master.
Right.
I believe.
And the idea of rune magic is that you can tap into these energy fields and then kind of redirect them and beam them. So you can take the energy of a particular rune and pull it down from up here and then redirect it through yourself and beam it to where you need it to go.
Like a runic Hadouken?
Or you can
what is this?
redirect the runic energy to create a protective circle or sphere around yourself or something like that.
You heard it here first, guys. You can...
And again, that's all coming from pre-war Germanic occultism. Futhark has this thing where you can do various magical by putting your body in the shape of a particular rune. So if you want to do a magic working involving Fehu, you might stand like this. And if you want to do one invoking Elhaz, you stand like that. And there was even a Germanic occultist, I can't remember who it was, that came up with runic sex positions, where you put your body and the body or bodies of whoever it is that you're having a good time with into various runic positions.
Wow.
So
yeah, he sample illustration of this. Fehu is kind of interesting.
So let me break down why Stephen Flower's work in this particular instance is problematic. So one, the people he was working with were also some of the heaviest influencers on Nazi occultism. Number two, Hermeticism and late 19th century mysticism, which what this pulls from, appropriates from closed practices such as Kabbalah. Number three, did I mention the Nazis?
You might have.
And to me, those are huge problems with his work and methodology, is that it's appropriating from closed systems and also working with people who, want to use the magic to, white people.
Well, you have to be careful because Hitler himself, who was the ultimate and final arbiter of what Nazi ideology was, because, he's the Führer, he does that sort of thing. Hitler himself was frequently very scornful of occultism and the pagan movements that were going around at the time. Somewhere in Mein Kampf, he talks about these idiots who just, in their pretend bear skins, but they'll run away from any communist blackjack.
Yeah, and he
somewhere in his writings he complains about
like a soup pot hat. Calls it like they're wearing a soup pot, like turning their soup pots upside down.
The point still being that it doesn't really matter to me. That's not the point. The point is that the fruit of the I would not eat an apple if it were grown in nuclear waste soil. And a lot of these practices come from nuclear waste soil. And that to me is the point. Not what is in the Nazi.
Is not a
that doesn't matter. What matters is these people were terrible people, and it's nuclear waste. Essentially, you're trying to grow something out of nuclear waste.
Hitler was not at all sympathetic to paganism, and neither were most of the Nazis, except for a little circle around Goebbels. But you have occultism is coming out of the same circles as the kind of romantic nationalism that ultimately fed the growth of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And certainly the Nazis did appropriate various runes, rune letters, the double, the Sol or Sowilo rune that was used as the emblem of the SS. Which one do they use? It was that the Elhaz rune was the symbol for their eugenics program called Lebensbaum, spring of life.
Yep.
But the point being,
and the swastika. Well, okay, the Hakenkreuz.
Yeah.
The Hakenkreuz is not technically a rune, but it does show up on early bracteates and things like that, and it does seem to have been an important, maybe spiritual symbol. And of course, that's one that gets
it was part of their overall,
co-opted by
it was part of the overall myth making process that went on in that period of time. The myth of the Aryan myth, and using these symbols and recasting them and basically rewriting history in this particular image to create that narrative of whiteness, of a unified white identity, of a unified Aryan identity. That's what these symbols were used for in those cases. So no, I can see where Edred's dipping his quill into that sludge is problematic.
But the point I'm trying to make, I wasn't trying to argue Nazi semantics. I think we got way off course. All I was trying to say was these practices come from a very tainted place of racism and bigotry, and that's not good. In addition to they hate the Jews, but also we're going to steal their esoteric practices. Also cracks me up a little bit inside. But so I want to grab I'm sorry guys, I'm starting to wear down, but I want to grab a couple other people to talk about. And that is, I'm going to kind of group people together, and I'm going to basically call them the 2000s era rune writers, Diana, and a few others. There's another one that I would name, but I don't really want to say her name, but yeah, who have tarot inspired runic work. So you're looking at, comparing runes almost to tarot spreads. You have the increase of runic decks, which is what I use because I don't care. I'm not a purist. But you start moving into almost interdepartmental divination, because I don't know a better way to put it. But yeah, essentially where you start seeing practices being borrowed from other divination types and brought into runes. And you see that especially from Diana Paxson, and from some other kind of contemporaries in that era there. I'm trying to think of, and then also, I cannot forget Nigel Pennick's German runic astrology, where he tries to cast the runes as astrological signs.
Right. Pennick, he's done some good work on folklore, but he's really bad at giving you his sources. So he'll present an interesting fact, but then you have to go through a whole bunch of books to try to figure out where he got that. You cannot always tell what is solid folklore and what he pulled out of his butt. Excuse me.
I do wonder with after talking with
that's the case
with some friends who are all authors who've published with major authors. I do wonder if that's Pennick or that's the publisher, because I do know a friend of mine that recently published with a big publishing house had to fight to get citations in her book.
Yeah. Edward Thorson / Stephen Flowers actually did work for Llewellyn for a time as an acquisitions editor. He was responsible for getting Freya Aswyn's book into print.
And there's the name I didn't want to mention.
Sorry, but that's the.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, but that's that. Yeah, he got that into print, and I think he got Kveldolf Gunderson's Teutonic Magic.
Yeah.
Into print as well, but he ended up quitting because, as you suspect, Llewellyn, at least at the time, had absolutely no desire to publish anything rigorous. They would publish pretty, and this is when you have things like D.H. Conway's book on Norse magic coming out. That is again mostly pulled out of her butt. Edward later wrote that he quit because he was disgusted with the tide of what he called occultizoid nincompoopery. I will give the man this: he has a pretty good way with a turn of phrase.
So just to summarize, because I have heard this criticism levied against anybody who does rune work. So there's a criticism that goes on. It's like that all occultists who do rune work are pulling from, as Lauren was pointing out, that tainted well of late 19th century, early 20th century German Romantic occultism, and that they're all pulling from this tainted well, and thus any rune practice, any occultic practice in Norse paganism is a product of that. And it seems like what we're saying here is like, well, some of it certainly was inspired by that. Some people certainly read that and said, yeah, I like it.
Well, but the other side of it is you have
from completely different traditions.
Yeah. You have people like Sarenth Odinson, who's about to publish his book on intuitive runes, which is a completely different technique. You have my upcoming rune book that I'm working on, which is a deep analysis of the various rune poems, and divination, approaching divination from the point of view of it's all here. Whatever you're using is just to basically stimulate your unconscious mind. And mine is strictly based on rune poems and basically trying to fine tune listening to your inner self. There are a lot of emerging techniques. I know as we're reconstructing the esoteric program in the Troth, our goal is to not teach any of that, is to teach some of these techniques that are new and completely divorced from a lot of that, like the intuitive runes or, deep reading into the rune poems, that kind of work.
So we'll be clear about this. So the Troth does not teach or promote Edred Thorson's rune system.
Right now, the Troth doesn't teach or promote any rune system, but no, we don't.
Yes.
Yeah,
Also, yes.
The only, we don't teach or promote anything by Edred. Yes. Was he one of the founders of the Troth? Yes. Has he been an active member of the Troth since the early 90s? No. He has not been involved with this organization since the early 90s. We can kind of say the same thing for a lot of other people. Right now, there is no official runic curriculum in the Troth. We do not teach it. Are there people in the Troth who follow his stuff? Probably. We got 2,500 members. I don't know everybody. I don't know their business. I can't see your bookshelf.
Yeah, that's true. But
I can see Ben's, but not yours.
I don't have mine behind me right now.
And I wouldn't. Yeah. And I mean, Edward does have a PhD in this stuff that he got on provision of Edgar Ptolemey and Klaus Duvel, who are, two of the great Germanic scholars of the past. He knows the academic stuff as well as anybody does. And I don't want to say that his work doesn't have valuable insights in it. You just have to be really careful.
I don't think it does.
And
I think,
if you
but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It's like any aspect of heathenry. If you only base your practice on what we can absolutely document from the past, you have really short bloats. We don't have, Egil Skallagrimsson's personal bloat book or Egil Skallagrimsson's handy guide to everything, everything you need to know about the runes. Such things probably didn't exist, or on the off chance they did, survived. So you're always going to have to take pieces from what you do know of the past, and there's always going to be a certain amount of cutting and pasting and patching to get them to fit together into something that's got logical consistency and that fulfills your needs. And, when we get together and bloat, at Trothmoot or our kindred or anywhere, does it look exactly like what the Vikings would have done? Well, probably not. But ultimately, it's what works for us. We're trying to build on these old foundations, but ultimately we've got to do the work of building. And I think with runes, it's the same. If you restrict yourself to only what you absolutely know people did, you're not going to get anywhere. So I'm not opposed to people using the runes for divination. Any divination method is going to have to include a lot of guesswork and a lot of, maybe it could have, and a lot of, we don't know, but it works for us. And the ultimate test has got to be the practice.
I will say my criticism, the reason I don't think that Edred's books are worthwhile is I think they're outdated at this point. What scholarship and information he had, his last book was published over 20 years ago. So to me, there are better books. There are better books with better information, with more recent information, that I think are just better all around books than what he has, because the good information he has is kind of outdated.
And I'd say that I'd say this overall for reading books that are either outdated or heavily problematic is that some of these are just artifacts of their time. right? Like artifacts of what
Mhm.
people thought and believed in the early 90s, or artifacts of what people believed in the 80s, or what someone thought at this particular time. Some of them you take with the most massive grain of salt you possibly can, just saying, okay, this guy thought this. And I often read, if I ever read anything that Edward's done, usually it's actually like the intros or the biographical stuff where he's telling us like, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this, and trying to like piece together what's going on in heathenry at that time. Like there was one, like there's a couple parts of like his, what was it? The History of the Rune Guild that I found really
Mhm.
useful in terms of like understanding what his perspective was in during that time. Which I've heard other perspectives from. So I'm like, it's very interesting to hear like, oh, so this is what Edward was thinking at the time.
Mhm.
Okay. So from that point of view, it's
Yeah.
like, sure, I can sit down and read that book and say, that's how he interpreted that. That's how he felt at that particular time. But in no way would I ever read something from an author like that going into it thinking, I'm going to learn something that's going to fundamentally change what I believe or practice. I just
Mhm. Right.
But
The problem is the average person going into, the local pagan store, thinking, hey, I want to buy runes, is still pretty likely to encounter a book by Edward Thorson. And it takes a certain amount of experience and a certain amount of background reading and a certain amount of time in grade to be able to see, where Edward was coming from and where the potential flaws are, and where the dodgy German romanticism stuff is starting to leak in around the edges.
Yeah.
It takes a while to develop that sort of critical perspective on anything, and not just Edward's work. I mean, it takes a while to develop, to develop that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't touch his books until I was already well heathen for
And
like
some people never
10
do.
years.
And I'm going to put this out here. One
Yeah.
of the issues is that some people can't. Some people don't have time. Some people have disabilities. Not everything's accessible. Some people work 2 jobs, and that should not be a barrier. You must read all these books should never be something we tell people they have to
Totally
do.
agree. Totally agree. Well, folks, this has been a great
Yeah.
conversation about the history and
Well,
the present of the runes. Thank you guys. Thank you, Lauren, for powering through. And thank you, Ben, for being with us. I'm just so grateful for you guys' knowledge and for your sharing that with me as someone who doesn't really know a heck of a lot about the runes, and maybe there's someone out there in YouTube land who just learned a lot too. So from all of us here at the Troth, to all of you guys out there in cyberspace, this is All Thing Considered. Have a wonderful weekend.